How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to be talking about variables and data types in Python. So chances are, if you've coded before, you know what these two are, at least conceptually. If you haven't, that's totally fine. We're going to go through this step by step. So let's first define the data types in Python. So to start off with, we'll talk about ints. So an int, short for integer, is basically any number as long as it's a whole number. So 1, 100, any number as long as it's a whole number. Well, you might say, what about decimals? Is 1.5 an int? Well, no, actually, any number that's a decimal is actually a float. So anything, as long as it's a decimal, is a float. And then we'll talk about strings. So a string, or str for short, is actually anything that's surrounded by quotation marks. So in the last video, we actually did a hello world example, and inside the print statement, we actually had hello world in quotation marks. So that was actually a string, right? This is actually a string because it's surrounded by quotation marks. So what about if it was actually a number surrounded by quotation marks? Is this an int? Or what about if it was actually a decimal surrounded by quotation marks? No, actually anything, literally anything surrounded by quotation marks is a string. You can literally say like some random gibberish, or you can put some random symbols. This is actually a string, right? Because it's surrounded by quotation marks. And you might say, well, what about singular quotation marks? Is this still a string? Yes, this is still a string because it's still a quotation mark. In Python, whether it's a singular or a double quotation mark, it does not matter, it's still a string. In other languages, this might differ, but in Python, this is not the case. And the last basic data type that I actually want to discuss today is a Boolean. So a bool, short for Boolean, is actually a true or false value. That's all it is. And it's very important that the Boolean must be capitalized. If it's not capitalized, then it's not actually a Boolean. And as you can see, even the editor knows this, and it actually colors the Boolean blue in this case. And then when you actually define or try to define a Boolean but don't actually capitalize it, it doesn't actually color it because it knows that it's not actually a Boolean. So these are the basic data types in Python. There's obviously more complex ones that we're going to be discussing in the next few videos, but these are the basic ones. So I'm actually going to put out a few examples just to make sure that you guys fully understand the different data types. So try and figure out what data type this is, and you can pause the video once I am done. So, right. All right, so pause the video and try and figure out which data type all these are. Alright, so starting off, what is this? This is a number surrounded by quotation marks. Well, what does that mean? Well, right away you can tell if it's surrounded by quotation marks, then what is it? It's a string. Well, what about this? This is a number. Yeah, so it's a whole number, so that means it's actually an int or an integer. And what about this? There's a bunch of letters and numbers and it's surrounded by quotation marks. Well, I don't care what's inside. As long as it's surrounded by quotation marks, that means it's a string, whether it's double quotation marks or single quotation marks. What about this? True. It's capitalized, so that means it's a true value, so it's a Boolean. Well, what about this? This is surrounded by quotation marks, but it has a decimal inside. Does this mean it's a float? No, it's surrounded by quotation marks. That means it's a string. Alright, so hopefully you guys now understand the different data types in Python, and now let's actually talk about variables. So if you've I'm sure you've done some basic math before, so I'm sure you must have seen something like x is equal to 5, where x is a variable. So it's the same thing in programming, right? You define variables, right? You give it a name, in this case x, and then you give it a value, and then that variable can actually change, right? You can do x plus, you can add 5 to that value, right? You can say x minus 5. So it's the same thing in programming, right? A variable is something that can change and it has a value, right? So the beauty of variables is that you can easily access them, right? So let's say imagine that a variable is actually a box, right? So let's say I had a box called, right, x, right? And then inside that box, I have a value 5. So I'm basically putting something inside that box, in this case, the value 5. And then to actually make sure I'm able to, to call that or to reference to that box, I'm actually labeling that box with a name, which in this case is x, right? So that's kind of how variables work in programming and in general, right? So you would have a name or a label for that variable and then a value. So in Python, we just discussed the different data types. So that means that a variable can be any of these data types, and then again, there's more complex data types we're going to be discussing in later videos, but for these 4 basic data types, a variable can be any of these data types. So let's say I want to define a variable called name, and I want to actually make it a string. So the value of that variable name is actually a string, so it's actually my name, right? And then we can actually print this variable, right? So instead of actually printing my name like this, passing it in as a string as we did last video, we can actually call the variable. We can say, hey, you know what? I actually want to call that box with the label name, or that variable with the label name, and actually get that value. So let's see what this actually does. This actually prints the value of that variable name, which is Shihab, which is my name, right? And so also you can actually change that variable, right? It's a variable, so that means it can change. So let's say I call it Henry. Let's say I change my name in the future someday, and I actually want to change it and print it to see if it changed. Well, as you can see here, it actually prints Shihab first, because that's what it was initially. And then when I change it, because it's a variable, so you're changing what you're putting in that box, basically. You're renaming my name, and you're printing it out, and then you get Henry, right? So that's kind of how variables work. And remember, I said that a variable can be any type, right? You can actually have a variable, call it, I don't know, num, and it can be an int, right? And then when you want to print that out, oops, sorry. You want to print that out, what is that going to be? It's actually going to be an int, right? And then let's say I actually want to make it actually a decimal. So I would say, and then I would print that out. Right? So then it gets 1.56, which is actually a float. So a lot of you guys who are coming from Java or C++ or C might be like, wait, what? How did you define a variable that was actually an int and then change it to a float? And then you guys might be confused if I do this, right? You guys might be like, what is going on here, right? Well, this is because, sorry, I actually wanted to print that out. In Python is actually a dynamically typed language. And what that means is you don't actually have to define the type beforehand. You don't have to say string num equals Shihab. You don't actually have to say, okay, this is the worst variable name for this case, but you would never actually have to say what the type is when you define the variable, right? Because unlike Java or C, C++, which are actually statically typed language, this is what you would see in Java or C, C++. This is called a statically typed language. Basically, right, you're making sure that this variable is always a string. You're defining it to be always a string, right? But in Python, which is an interpreted language, or a dynamically typed language, you're basically giving a variable a value, and then basically in runtime, that when the application runs, then this value is given, this variable is given a type, which in this case it is a float. So the type is defined when you actually run the application, when the interpreter actually figures out what this variable is and what the type is and what the value is, right? So that's the difference between Python and a few other commonly used languages that are actually statically typed, right? So it's important to understand the differences between other languages, just so when you actually learn these new languages, or you actually figure out the positives and the negatives, because being dynamically typed is pretty cool, right? But there's also less type safety. So what that means is, let's say you actually want to, you actually are expecting a variable to be of a certain type, right? And then you actually get the value of that variable to be a different type. So like, wait, what's going on? I actually want it to be a different type, right? So this would never happen in Java, because if that happens in Java, you actually an exception would be thrown because it was expecting a different type, right? So now that you guys understand the basics, oh, and also I didn't show you an example of a Boolean. Let's just erase this, just because this is not Python, this is Java, right? To show you an example of a Boolean as well. A Boolean can be a variable. You can call it, I don't know, Boolean example. Sorry. What the? Oops. All right, and then you would print that out. Okay, I can't type today, guys. Sorry. What? I literally can't type. Okay, so if I print that out, what is that value? It's true, right? So a lot of you guys might say, well, what is this underscore? Well, this is just naming convention. To name your variables, there are only certain rules that you have to follow, right? The first rule is, first of all, you cannot start the variable name with a number. You cannot say one name, right? This would not work, and automatically it's giving you red saying that, hey, you can't do this, right? But you can't do this. Let's try doing this, right? I spelled my name wrong, but who cares? It's not going to work anyways, right? You get invalid syntax because what? You cannot start a variable name with a number. You can have a number inside, right? You can have it here. I can literally put it at the end. I can put whatever I want, as long as it does not start with that number. See, it didn't throw any errors, right? Because I didn't start it with a number. As soon as I started with a number, oops, error. Another thing is you can actually include underscores, right? You can actually include underscores inside your variable name like I did here, right? That's totally fine. But you cannot actually have other symbols. You cannot actually have a star, whether it's in the beginning or in the middle, or you cannot have like a period or like a dash. You cannot have other symbols. You can only have an underscore, letters, or numbers. And then the variable names cannot start with a number, right? These are the only rules. See, you cannot actually define that variable because this actually stands for something else in Java and sorry, Python. I said Java because I was comparing it to Java. All right, so now that you guys understand what the data types or the basic data types are in Python, and then how you actually can define variables and actually access them and print those values out, and then how you can actually name variables without running into any errors or exceptions, now we can actually move on to more complex and more fundamentals of Python that we're going to be discussing in later videos. So thanks again for watching, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned.